My name is Dr. Ted Wapham. I'm Dean of the Ann and Joe O. Newhoff School of Ministry, and it is my pleasure to be working with the diocese and with members of the university community to facilitate this presentation. Our speaker tonight, our facilitator, is Dr. Jody Hunt. Dr. Hunt is a member of the University of Dallas Newhoff School of Ministry faculty. She joined us in 2017 after completing her PhD in religious education from Fordham University in New York. She also holds a master's degree in theology from Oblate School of Theology and works in the area of digital theology. Her dissertation research focused in this area, as have her two most recent publications, which you can find and I'll make available to you after our meeting. But we're really excited for Dr. Hunt to be with us and to facilitate this conversation. And without further ado, I give you Dr. Hunt. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ted. A couple of things before I lay out the ground rules is that as we go through here, a lot of what's interesting about digital theology is so much of this is familiar to us. So I really encourage you not to shut down and say, she's not saying anything new. Why am I here? A lot of the understanding and our exploration will come out of our conversations. And hopefully starting at the roots of theological discourse around digital theology, we can kind of bridge out and think differently about some of the things we're already doing as we have been thrown into this digital world very quickly as Catholics. And really all denominations in trying to meet the gap that's been created by the pandemic. So with that, I'll just give you sort of outlining of what our work will be here today. And so basically, we're going to look at the ways we can establish and remain digitally connected as the body of Christ. So that's our root understanding of what we're trying to do here. With that, we're going to start off. I'm a Trinitarian person, so we're going to have three things. So first, we're going to look at the table of Christ and the theological foundations of what it means to be Catholic and connected to each other. But we're going to look at it like it's sort of defining the digital communion and what that is. And we'll look at some scholarship that's been created around that in the last year or so, and really, really fresh. It's been in the last year that this has sort of taken shape in American Catholicism. Then we're going to look at the digital way and routes to take. And this is probably where you're going to start hearing, oh, Dr. Hunt, of course I know to do this. Of course we've been trying this. But we can think about it in a little bit more in depth, and we'll have times to stop and talk to each other and share best practices as we kind of go along, because just because we're doing something, we have to ask the question, maybe is it effective or ineffective? So that will be our work there today. And then the last part will be the communion of peoples and the sustaining relationships. So we get people online, we get engaged. What does that mean? And how do we sustain that communion of people? How do we keep that going? How do we get that momentum going? And an example of that would be, if you think back to the early pandemic, everybody's like running around, everyone's excited to see each other. And now we've been doing it for 6 months and we all have Zoom fatigue. So how do we work through those type of things so we stay digitally connected to each other when we're not in our parishes in the same way that we were 6 months ago? All right, is everyone ready? Yes?
Yes.
So we start here, the table of Christ, theological foundations. And as I said, this is actually very, very new work. Since about 2014, there's been a couple of theologians who sort of popped up on the map. The first one, Antonio Spadaro, who's a Jesuit priest. And so he has sort of termed a little bit of a more, I guess, a digital technology. Now, to sort of outline this of how difficult it is to define digital theology, is that there's cyber theology, there's spiritual technology, there's digital theology, and every word you could possibly think is all in between. The theology of the internet is another one. And we haven't really landed on, especially really across the world, on a really hard, sort of in the box type word to describe what this work is. I tend to lean on digital theology because that encompasses a little bit more than just the internet or just social media and things like that. But there are people who really get really niche specific. But I like this about from Spadaro is with the spiritual technology, and I think it gets at the core of what technology can be for us. And so he leans on Pope Benedict. And so Pope Benedict actually began, it's probably John Paul II wrote a little bit on technology in the World Communications Day, which was established after Vatican II. And sort of the popes have been dealing with communications and media for a while. But Pope Benedict was the one who really latched onto the age of the internet, and he saw the rise from us having basic internet to the explosion of social media. And then Pope Francis has carried the ball onward. But Pope Benedict in his wisdom says, if we used wisely, technology can contribute to the satisfaction of the desire for meaning, truth, and unity, which remains the most profound aspiration of each human being. And so when we look at digital communion and we look at digital theology, that's what we're getting at. We're not just talking about how to use the tools. So yes, I'll talk about social media, and yes, I'll talk about, you know, the Zooms and things like that we're using. But those are tools. Those aren't the real deep metaphorical or even like the deepest sense of roots of what it means to be digital human beings. There's also a professor called Professor Kirk Bingaman out of Fordham University, and he's a pastoral counselor. He's actually written a book on pastoral care in the digital age, and he talks about artificial intelligence and how people interact with artificial intelligence, the AI world, and how that is shaping our minds. And you may see this with young children. And so when we look at digital theology and we look at those really, really deep roots, we're looking at the meaning and the truth and unity. And the Catholic Catechism, if you know your catechism well, it starts up with that all humans have the desire to seek out God and to know him. And so digital theology and using spiritual technology is a way to seek out God in the digital spaces. And we see it really as one and the same in reality. People differentiate between digital and then lived experience, and digital theologians, we see them as one and the same because there is no really black and white ground there. Everything's become so gray in one or the other. And so we have to think about in our parishes, what does that mean? What does it mean for us to present ourselves in the digital world? You know, we're not just doing it in order to be, you know, just getting numbers and just seeing faces and doing this, but there's something really deep happening here on how we stay connected in those digital spaces. And that's really the core root, essential root of what we're doing online. And here's just a reference of where that quote is from. So then we move on to this, it's sort of like, what is this? So Incarnational Technology is another one. So, and the means of social communication in 1971, they said Christ is the ultimate perfect communicator. And so here we have, so how should we model ourselves? And again, these are just foundational groundworks. Look to Christ, right? I mean, it was pretty phenomenal. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Bill Riley. I know, like him or love him or hate him. But someone had one, and I heard this years ago. Someone had asked him why he's Christian. And I wanted to say, it was like on one of those, quick questions they do with sometimes, news pundits. They'll say, oh, today someone asked me this question, and they kind of go into it. But I always stuck with it. I just happened to catch it on some random day. And they asked him, they said, well, why are you Christian? Why are you Catholic? And he said, because he talked about Christ being the perfect communicator. He's like, I have all the technology in the world to get out my message. He had nothing. He had just his people. He had just his way and his stories, and it completely transformed the world around him, and it continues to today. And he's never been seen on Facebook, never been seen on social media. And so to think about that, and to think about ways that we can too, to sort of really bring ourselves into that incarnational, to flesh out the presence of God in the digital spaces. It also has a spiritual and theological communication is involved with this as well. And so Christ incarnate in all platforms, even if it's just a text message. How can I be Christ for others? How do I communicate as Christ into those spaces? This new work here, this is a very new, very new, is actually from Catherine Schmidt. She is a professor up in Malloy College, I believe it's on Long Island, Queens area. And I actually got connected with her in Catholic Twitter because people began to buzz about what she was doing. Massimo Fagioli had said something about her book. Her book is phenomenal. It's called Digital Communion. And I highly recommend that you grab it. You can find Catherine Schmidt on Amazon. So this is where we land. So all this talk about theology, and this is where we land, is the actual table of Christ. when you look at, and you're looking at your parish spaces, so let's say you're looking even at your parish, Facebook page, you're looking at your parish's website, is how do I reflect the table of Christ? So when people land in these digital spaces, whether it's a Zoom meeting or just a check-in or it's confirmation or catechesis digitally, how do we reflect Christ as communicator, as he's incarnate in the flesh and blood, right? And so how do we do that? And that's what our deepest meaning behind this. And I also will say a side note is that if you had not stopped and reflected upon these things, then you need to place a pause on what you're doing digitally and take a step back to really think it through. One of the things that I think goes awry in Catholic media is that we don't really stay connected to those really deep theological questions that come up with living in those digital spaces and being digital people. And because we do that, we do things quickly and we do things without thinking. And certainly you have a mess of things that have no really deep-rooted meaning in what we're trying to do or convey. It's just another hoop to jump in. It's just another meeting to attend. And so we must be more intentional before we even get off the ground in terms of those really deep understanding of how do we take our real lives in flesh at the table of Christ, and how do we place them put them into flesh in the digital spaces. Another way you can look at it is digital discipleship. That is a totally another talk on another day. But I have done work in digital discipleship, and I encourage you to also research that because that kind of fleshes out the communication. We're doing more of the communication side today and staying in communion with each other. Digital discipleship will look at those individual, how do we act as apostles to each other as well. So then here's Catherine Schmidt, and she coined it. She's the first one to get to the plate as virtual communion. And so she says this: the community is virtual insofar as the Eucharist is celebrated not only with and for those present in the building of its ritual, but in unity with and for two other communities as well, as members of the body of Christ throughout the earth and the communion of saints. And so when we enter into those digital spaces and we think about how do we form communion with each other, when we're sitting across the world from each other, we're sitting just, it's kind of silly now. You may be having meetings where the person next door is on the Zoom meeting with you. Like, how do we connect with each other when we can't really physically be in spaces right now or even in the future? Because, whatever prevents us from doing so. One way to think about it is to go back to that table of Christ and how the reception of the communion and the Eucharist, and of course, I understand that you may be thinking, oh, Dr. Hunt, but we're not all receiving right now, right? We're not all receiving. We have that's another theological question, is that virtual communion that we are, the spiritual communion that we partake in, that unifies us together. Whether it's spiritual communion or those who are able to physically receive right now, we're unified as in the body and blood of Christ. And that unity cannot be broken. And so because we're there, we're unified with the saints. And so it doesn't matter if we're in digital spaces or in physical spaces, by getting together and gathering together and with an intentionality to live that out with each other and walk with each other, that is the ultimate goal of this virtual space. And that's what we need to be intentional about when we have these programs centered around the digital world. So with that, we come to our first reflection question. So our first, and we're going to have you break out into groups. I think they're randomly chosen. And I'm going to leave you with this question. How has digital technology extended your connection to the body of Christ and or helped you answer the call to continue to contribute to God's creation? And I'll read it one more time. How has digital technology extended your connection to the body of Christ and or helped you answer the call to contribute to God's creation? Okay, I'm going to assume most people are back. If not, then they'll gather in a couple of seconds. I hope your initial conversations were fruitful, and you may have had some venting given where you are in your parishes. I get that. I will say that I've been frustrated too in the last 6 months, and I'll go ahead and let you guys know. I don't like going to Mass in digital spaces as much as I am a digital person. I just can't connect to it or pay attention, and I think a lot of that has to do is that when I'm in a digital space, I have 5 or 10, 15 tabs open, and so it's hard for me to just really zone in and focus. It takes a lot of effort, but it's a good place to be. And what's helped me though is is to look at those theological connections and to look at imagery and those different things, and to really think about the communion with people. I know I won't always be able to physically be at Mass. I know I won't always be able to physically be involved in the parish and in certain ways, but what can I do digitally, and how can I prepare myself into those digital spaces is the root of a lot of theological exploration that I do. So moving forward, let's get on to a little bit more of the practical side, because you probably want answers to questions you have. We're going to look at the routes to take. Again, a lot of these you probably have already done or tried. Maybe you tried it and went terribly. It was a disaster. And so you jumped off the bandwagon very quickly. And so hopefully we can just kind of think about the roots, and it's not just about those digital tools. I'm not going to tell you about Facebook and Canva and all that. I can certainly answer those questions. But I really want to talk about like some of the roots that we take, and to be more intentional about how we use those tools to build digital communion. So the first thing is, before your journey, you need to get a map. I know we didn't really have a whole lot of time before the pandemic started to get our maps organized. One minute we were going to church and Lent was happening, and the next minute we were told to stay home and never come back again. And so it was a crazy time. And then we're told it'd be 2 weeks, and now it's been 6 months. And there's parts of our country that are still, especially in California, especially it's in the news a lot, their churches are still not meeting, except for outdoor masses. And so everything has gone digital as much as they possibly can. And of course we got to this and we're thinking, okay, we had a little bit of a summer to get our maps ready, but even those maps are not well crafted, because this is new uncharted territory for us, right? We're in a crazy sea at times, right? And there's waves just crashing and the hurricanes are coming at us, and we're having to find and create these maps in the midst of a storm. And so couple of questions to help us to sort of ground ourselves and take a moment. And the first one, and so really think about this, is what do you envision your church's or school's digital identity to be? And have you ever thought about that question before? And really think about that. And I can speak from a millennial side. When I want to look up something, we all go to Google. It's a terrible habit what we do. And so if I'm going to think about going to a local parish for Mass on a Sunday morning, perhaps I'm traveling, I'm going to get on my phone and I'm going to Google. The first thing I see is digital space with that parish's name on it. And so what does that mean? And what is that identity? Because we all have a certain identity in those digital spaces. And if you haven't asked your question, if you haven't stopped with your parish staff or your catechist and said, what do we want to be digitally, then you need to do that in your next meeting and really think about it. Is there a certain charism? Is there a certain mission statement? Is there a certain, something you saw somewhere else that you're like, hey, I hope we're that too. And put the pen to paper and really bring it up. Put it on your website, put it somewhere, put a statement about who you want to be digitally. And it can have all different forms. And then once you have that conversation, also think about what do you think of you as digital right now? So when you go onto your websites and Facebook pages, or you can just look at your parishes and see what you're doing on Sunday morning Mass when you're sharing out to the world, so others can participate. What is your current digital identity there? So what are you doing, right? So if a stranger goes into those spaces, who are you? Are you Christ for others? Do you just look like a business and people can easily like lose the Catholic identity as they scroll through your pages because it's all business? Like, who are you? And so have those conversations, and you have to have them. That's going to be the way you lay that groundwork for those maps and for those routes. I really highly, highly, highly encourage you. Back at Fordham, I worked as a GA. And we had to create websites and things, and I had to keep up with it and all the fun things. And so we had an actual Post-it map on our wall, and we took like the major types of places we want to be and who we want to be identified, and then we would write it in our meetings and we post it on the wall. So that way, whenever we're working in those digital spaces, we easily looked up and said, who do we want to be, and we would be reminded of those things. Those are really easy, like low-hanging fruit type things, but I don't think a whole lot of us do that, because if we did, our websites would be better looking, and how we engage our audience on Facebook would be far different game story. We'd would be reaching out, looking for those communal places rather than just trying to get information across. Other things you need to do is before you step out into your journey, you need to make sure your website or homepage is up to date. I know many of you are like, of course, Dr. Hunt, we know that. But have you been to our parish's websites lately? Some of them are really awesome and amazing, and other ones are like, I don't know, they're just muddled messes, and it's hard to find information. And I'll give you an example from Catholic Twitter, and I meant to bring the quote up, but I couldn't find where I saw it. But I did see this. I saw a young student, I believe he was a UD student, who shared, he's like, just as a weekly reminder, it took me 5 clicks to find the confession times for my parish. And that's an issue, right? When you have a fast-paced society and people are coming to your website looking when I can connect to a priest, they want to know where can I find father or deacon. They want to know when mass times are. They want to know when the sacraments are celebrated, confession, baptism. They want that information. And if we have to click more than 1 or twice, you're going to lose us. And people are going to jump off that website. So little questions like that. And so how do you do that? First, you need to find a consultant, someone in your parish who's willing to give their time to really go through there and test those links, and to say, find somebody who in your family, find somebody you know well, who's not part of your parish, to go in there and test those links and tell you things are intuitive or not. And do that often. I would say try to do that every quarter, or every time you make a change to your website, because if you're not doing those type of things, any type of work, communal work, is not going to work, because people need to find quickly where to find. Use imagery, use that identity again, really sacred images and art to really reflect of who you are as a people. You're not just a bingo hall, right? You're not a digital bingo hall. So what is sacred art in those images that you can draw people in to really think and reflect about your identity as a parish, and start that and lay that groundwork, because any other route is not. Think about the quote, all roads lead to Rome. All web pages lead to your parish. You have to have really good web pages. All those routes lead back to that homepage. So moving from there, is the next one is, when you're finally ready to take that first step, you must be present. Like really present. And I know some of you are like, of course I am, Dr. Hunt, I reply to emails and things like that, but how fast do you reply? So a good rule of thumb is within 24 to 48 hours. Now, I know there's always going to be those emails that you're thinking, oh, Dr. Hunt, you're crazy. I only have, X amount of hours in the day. I'm part-time. I'm not getting paid for this at all. I'm a volunteer. How can you possibly expect me? But if you're going to put your information out there that you are present to the people who need you, whether it's regards to an email about catechesis, an email about, school, something happening at the parish school, an email about where to find father because you're having a crisis, whatever it is, you need to be present to them. You need to show them that you are. And it could be just a reply. So even if you just set it up to an automatic reply and say, this is an automatic reply that someone has heard you somewhere, and I will be in touch with you in X amount of days. So somebody knows that you're there and that something has been received, right? Just like us, like we desire, when you go to pray, our hope, our highest of hopes is that we physically hear the voice of God to tell us what to do, right? That would be so much easier, right? If we prayed and God said, hey, by the way, Jody, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. That's my plan for you. Get back on, but we don't hear it that way. And so think about that human desire and being present digitally to other people. We want to know that we've been heard, right? And that needs to come by way of confirmation email, by responding to Facebook posts. This doesn't have to be hard stuff. Just do it, make it a daily habit. I run the PTO page for my children's school page. I volunteer to do this. And I have the daily habit from 8 to 9 till my workday really begins. I just go online and I set up my replies. I make sure people know that I'm around and things like that. I have like that digital daily habit. And they also know that I don't do it on weekends, right? I still observe Sabbath. It's not encroaching on anything. But those digital daily habits to show that we're present speaks volumes to people, and it really keeps us engaged with each other in a way that it's quite profound. So the next step here is step 2 is listen to your audience. Now, and when I say listen, I mean like really listen. How many of you when's the last time you went into the back end of your websites or your Facebook page and looked at some analytics about who was visiting? I think you'd be surprised that it's not always parishioners, or that the people coming are looking for certain. So let's go back to our web pages here. Your audience, you can find out so much information. You can find out if you have a really good webmaster who can drill down to those analytics. If not, then call the people who oversee your website. They can help you with it. Drill down to the information. You can tell where they clicked from, where they live, how many clicks how long they stayed. You can tell where geographically, geo-targeted, where they are, all those different nuggets. Sometimes you can even drill down and say that they're probably male or female, depending on where they went after, and all the cookies that are saved. It's quite phenomenal information you can get from analytics on your social media, on your web pages. Get that information. That's going to tell you who your parishioners are. You can see where they went. Sometimes you can find out what they're more likely to do based on how they acted on your website. Perhaps your web traffic is saying that a lot of people are looking for baptisms and baptism prep. Well, that tells you a lot about your audience and the things that they need to see and hear. That tells you we have a lot of families looking at your parish. What can we offer them? How can we engage them and bring them into communion and invite them? How can we outreach our families? Maybe you don't have a whole lot of people looking at early childhood education or early sacraments of initiation. You have more people looking for adult faith formation and clicking on that. So you can think about, well, what do we need to offer them to bring them into community? Where can we do that outreach to them? So look at those analytics, get to know your audience, and get to know what they need from you. And also, it doesn't have to be, have Zoom listening sessions, right? Ask people, let's have a listening session for, even if it's just two people talking. It's really important that we understand what they need from us digital spaces. Ask them to, when you have, a parish minister, going back to Heidi Campbell's work early in the pandemic, one thing she noticed is that there was little engagement between the pastor in the actual space, the communal space, and the people watching digitally online. They never addressed the people of the audience on the other side. And so the question she raised was, how can we be the next step more pastoral? How do we know our audiences well enough that they need to be heard, they need to be seen? And so how can the priest or the pastors look in the camera and say, I see you, we're so happy you're here with us to celebrate? And not just say it out to the audience in front of them, but look at the camera and say, I see you, I'm so happy you're here to celebrate with us. And those are really important pastoral moments. Really important and powerful pastoral moments. It's how we reflect Christ, right? Think about Christ looking to the blind and the tax collectors and all the people who had been marginalized, and he looked at them in their eyes. One of the best story, one of my favorite stories in the Gospels is when Christ, when the woman reached out and she was the unclean woman, and she's lying in the streets and no one wants to touch her because she's untouchable. And Christ walks by and she latches onto his cloak. And he could have easily scorned her because he's a rabbi and he's clean. He's not supposed to be touched by them. And yet he turns around and looks at her and he saves and heals her. So how can we use digital spaces and be those pastoral presence to people is a really important step. And looking at them and saying, I see you. What can I do for you? And to think about that as pastor, as laity, how do we engage in those spaces? And I know and I totally get, we are so over Zoom. I'm over Zoom too. If I had to have another PTO meeting, I'm tired of meeting on Zoom. I want to see my people and be in the room and laugh and just see the expressions on their face, because not everyone has good internet connection. We can always, be 100%. I miss that. But at the same time, I know this is what best we have right now. And those spaces will come again. So how do I be really pastoral and seeing and hearing other people and be more intentional that in my meetings, I'm doing the same thing? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in sustaining. Step 5 is learn to be okay without control. You have no control over digital spaces. There's going to be trolls. There's going to be people who get really nasty on your comments. That's one of the reasons you have to pay very close attention to your pages, because random strangers will post things just because they're anti-Catholic. And so you have to be okay with that. Don't allow fear to interfere with you being digitally present. Because if you do, then you will never go online. You have to be okay with not having control of how many people show up, and technology failing and all that. There really is a resting in God to still from St. Augustine, the resting in God, the digital rest in God too. It's just letting go and letting the Holy Spirit do what he's going to do with this situation. There's great humility. Your websites will crash, Facebook will crash, Zoom will crash, and you have to get okay with that. And you have to support each other being okay with that too. There's always the person who just can't be okay with that, and you will cancel a session the minute something goes wrong. And you have to work through that. And you have to say, you know what, if I can't have my video on, that's okay, because I'm here present with you. If I can't get, the Facebook up and running, I'm going to have to be okay with the trolls. I'm going to have to work with the trolls. I'm going to have to, deal with, Mrs. Smith, who constantly badgers me on Facebook. I can't control those things, but I can control my identity and I can let go. So again, let's reflect. Let's take a couple of minutes and let's talk together and engage in questions. So the first question is our sharing. Let's share our best practices. So what routes have you taken along the digital way? How were they helpful or unhelpful in forming a communion of persons and making those really deep theological connections? And what, in your opinion, are new routes that are needed? So I'll repeat the question one more time. What routes have you taken along the digital way? How were they helpful or unhelpful in forming a communion of persons, and what new routes are needed? For the sake of time now, moving on to communion of people. So we established these relationships, we have our websites, we have our maps, everything's going great. So how do we sustain them? Because people lose interest really quickly, especially young people. Like we have Gen Z who's in college right now, the millennials are off and they have families. And if you don't keep their interest and keep moving forward constantly, you lose them altogether and they disappear. And so how do we keep them engaged? Because they will flight really fast off the ship if they're not having fun. And so the first thing is that you have to be consistent. So let's say you get out of here today and you're like, I am on fire. Dr. Hunt lit a fire. I'm going to go back. Let's do our parish website. Let's get going in this. And suddenly you're really great for 2 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, or even 6 months. And suddenly we never hear from your parish website again. Nothing ever changes off of Facebook. And before we know it, it's been 2 years before you tweeted out something. That's not going to fly. And people are going to think, what happened to them? Did that parish burn down? Like, where are they still around? Like, what's going on with that parish? What's going on with that school? And things like that. And so when you're looking at and you're doing these really great work, and as you're already doing, think of the ways that you can be consistent, and also the things you can't sustain, and let those things go. If you have too many social media accounts right now and you're pulling your hair out because you're like, oh, I put it on Instagram, I forgot to Facebook, or I did this, then you need to drop a ball and be really good in one space that you know your parishioners are going to use, that's helpful, that's great for your audience, or that your parents are going to use, and stick with that. And don't continue to reinvent the wheel. Don't say, okay, today we're using Flocknote, next week we're going to use it here. Oh, that didn't work. Next year we're changing to that. You need to find something and stick to it at least 2 years, I would say, before you really need to change ship. Because if you're changing ships too often, people lose interest and you're going to lose them. You have to stay consistent, and you have to be okay with letting go. And you have to be okay with not jumping onto every new, when you go to those Catholic conferences, you have all the app people who are willing to sell you, like, oh, use my parish app, use this app, use that. I'm like, oh, this is great. This is great. You're going from booth to booth saying how great. You got to stop doing that. You got to walk away and say, I already have something, and stick with it for a little bit, because you confuse people. And then when you get on there and you choose your group, be really, really consistent with it. Create plans, put pen to paper, do a marketing plan. Usually when I got my social media, I do it week by week because that's all I had time for. But if you are doing communications out to parents, or you're doing communication, whether it's catechesis or your schools and things like that, plan it out into quarters and say, what major events do we have? Let's put it on our calendar. Let's do this, and be consistent with it. Make it a yearly habit that in April that you sit down and you look at what's coming out in the next liturgical year, what's coming down the pipeline, and be consistent with your posts. And there are really great parish companies out there to help you, and school companies that can help you with that if you're interested in paying for it. There's also really great parents who are willing to volunteer, and other parishioners who can help with that. The next thing is remain interactive, right? And so when you're having a Zoom session, is how do when I'm creating those digital spaces in communion, how do I have to where I'm not just doing a talking point? It's really easy to run a meeting, and I do this myself. I'm guilty as charged, where you're just talking, and before you know it, 30 minutes has gone by, and no one said a word other than you. So how do I remain interactive when we're meeting like this over Zoom? How do I remain interactive on my parish website? Like Mary had pointed out, like those digital forms, how do I make them engaging so that people, are easy to able to find them and they're interacting with them? What about placing videos or other content up? There's a lot of great content up. Bishop Barron is an easy go-to example. There's a lot of websites, parish websites. He will integrate some of his like 3-minute short videos. Like I went to one today when I was reading up on RCA that I'm teaching, and they had a Bishop Barron video on there that was only 3 minutes long. It got right to the point about RCA, and it fit very well with the I guess the point of the page was. That was interactive, and that kept me on the page long enough to read through the rest of the stuff. Like those type of things are really easy to do in your parish websites. Be interactive in terms of your text messaging or flock note. Use the polling app. One thing that I liked about our parish is one time they asked us, for better or for worse, because I know everyone has their opinion, they asked us what we liked most about Mass. And of course we all like, oh, we love to have more bells and smells. We like this, we don't like this. We love that children are so welcomed in our parish. But it was a really great way to hear other voices of the parish, and to be interactive with each other in that digital space, than we would have otherwise of just going to Mass and leaving. It was probably perhaps the first time I spoken to some of my the parishioners, my fellow parishioners, in that interactive space. So think about how you can use digital tools to engage with each other, can help really strengthen the communion of people. So moving forward, also encourage relationships that makes everyone feel valued. And this is something, Marty Jewell, who is a professor emeritus here at University of Dallas Newhoff, she did a study one time on parishes, and she and I were having one of those, over wine conversations at a conference, and she was explaining to me how she did the study. And she said, I went around to a lot of parishes in my diocese at the time, and she's like, and how many times, Jody, somebody actually addressed me and said hello? I was like, well, at least, half of them, I'm sure. And she's like, one time. I went to like 10 different parishes, and only one person ever looked at me when I walked in the door and said, hi, we're welcome. What can we do for you? And so she said that part of her study, that's what they found, is the importance of acknowledging people, making them feel valued. And so one thing to sustain relationships, we have to do that digitally. So when we have PTO meetings over Zoom, if we have, meetings over, Instagram or Facebook Live and things like that, it goes back again to what I said about looking at the camera and saying, I see you and I hear you. That's so, so important. Because if we don't acknowledge the human presence of the other person, and really in digital spaces, we're all marginalized to an extent and siloed in ways that we never, can possibly imagine. We're siloed in these different areas. If we don't engage that and really make the human person feel valuable in those moments that we do engage each other online, then we're not going to continue to build a communion of God, and instead our bodies are separated and siloed even more. Do we have any questions or any thoughts?
Amen.
Amen. Okay. I know Mary, so she.
Sorry. It's all good, man. It's perfect.
Yeah, Mary's fantastic. All right. So the next one is continually offer honest communication. Even bad communication. Like, don't be, I think this goes back, we kind of fleshed this out before. Autumn helped us with that, with those, is that offering honest communication and feedback. Even the hard communication. So let's say the flock note, you have to put out a communication that's something, let's say our priest has been very good about reminding us to make sure that we wear our mask when we proceed up to receive communion, and to really make, they tell us every every Mass, they said, be sure to keep your mask on, walk up to the front, step 3 times, so, because he knows there's a lot of people that come in and out of our parishes right now that usually don't come every week, and that's understandable, but he's honest about it. So in our digital spaces, we have to be honest, even if people, people don't like it. I mean, they don't. We have people who kind of, okay, come on, that's ridiculous, right? And they still try to take their mask off. But we have to be honest and open, and we have to do this in explaining the whys of it. and in our communication, and also not to present ourselves as someone that we're not. So if you present yourself, so let's say you're doing something, this happens a lot in the digital spaces. There's you can become anonymous, right? Have you ever heard of the TV show Catfish? Some of you with littles may know it. If you have high schoolers, I know it because I watched it in college. But the people pretend that they're somebody they're not. It's an MTV show. And then this guy Nev and his friend, they go and they try to figure out who the person really is, and it's never who they think it is. It's very, very rare they find someone presenting themselves and they really are that person. Well, they're being the term is called catfish. So basically, you're luring somebody in, you're casting that net based on their false pretenses. We cannot do that in our communications. We have to be honest of who we are. If your parish is a Hispanic parish and is culturally and really engaged, then don't present yourself as otherwise. Use that cultural language in your email communications, right? And those traditions, and let that flow through, because that's who you are. If your parish is really marginalized and doing a lot of work with immigrants, or they're working, like our parish is in the center of diversity in Irving, Texas, use that. Use those understandings and those cultural nuances to reach out to the audience and say, this is who we are, and be reflective of that. We're currently on a capital campaign at my parish, and our father has often said that we look like a bingo hall. So he wants to bring in all these Sacred Heart art and do all these really great things in our parish. And over and over he will say when he's putting out the baskets, it's like, we want to reflect our parish, and when people walk in, we want to reflect who we really are as people. And right now our sacred spaces don't do that. And that's the same thing with digital communication. And that helps us sustain that body of Christ. Again, from that reality, we are fully reflective of not just what's happening in the physical spaces, but when we do that digitally, we're showing people who we are in the body of Christ. And so we have to pay attention to be more intentional about that and being honest with who we are and to maintain that. And last but not least, you're going to think this is a really crazy idea, and Dr. Hunt has gone off the deep end, is that when you can, you need to meet in person. You have to meet in person. Eventually, you have to meet in person. I know it's really hard, hence why I have my people on mask. They're not socially distanced, but that's okay. That you really do. If you have a mother's group, for example, that meets online, and right now in the pandemic, that's the only way they can meet and do that ministry, or you can only do youth ministry online or something like that. You need to place it on the calendar, or you need to say, let's revisit in a couple of weeks. But eventually, we're going to meet for coffee. You should do that. You can still do digital ministry even outside of pandemics, but you should meet in person every once in a while, because that really brings the flesh. That's the incarnational. And that helps people to fully see that what they've been doing digitally can happen, and it's one of the same with reality and the parish life. The PTO meetings online, right? Whatever it is happening online, you have to be intentional that, when we go back to the regular same old, even if it's a newly formed group and it's a group that you say, oh, we're never going to meet in person, you need to make some time. There's a lot of, in academia, we have a lot of committee meetings, and a lot of it is done across the country with people from different institutions. And we make it a point in those that we always meet at least once together a year. Because you just have to. It's the fleshing out of what the communion, and you can see the bonds there when you walk into that room. First, it feels like you're looking at a celebrity because we're all on screens. But the second thing is, like, you immediately feel connected with them, and you feel that holy presence has come back full circle into the presence and the physical presence. And then you can go back digitally, and that's fine. But you need to be sure that you meet at least once, whether it's once a year, whether it's an annual thing, just do it. And I'll give you one last example. My husband was part of ACTS team, and he's not on the team, but he was part of that group. And so he went to ACTS, and they met, and that going back to those anniversary sessions once a year. So even if they don't see each other, but over text messages and at the parish here and there, meeting once a year really fully brings it back into full circle. And they really get that. And that's what keeps them so close together, is because they're intentional about making sure that they meet annually, right? And that's really what we have to do in those spaces, and find ways to do that with our people. So the final reflection question: where are the places that your parish or school, domestic church, because we can even talk about our families, can foster a deepening of a communion of persons? So where are those places? I think most people have rejoined us, so for the sake of time, we'll keep moving forward. I hope you're having good conversations about what you're hearing and seeing, and perhaps your imaginations are being stirred a little bit by our conversations this evening. I didn't bring this up in my conversations of just commenting back and forth when you guys were chatting. I didn't bring up virtual reality, but virtual reality is an interesting beast of a part, because there has been some chatter about if I can't physically be at Mass, if a virtual realm would help me feel more even digitally connected to what's happening. If you haven't done virtual reality, I highly recommend that you do, even if it's like at an amusement park or something, and just imagine. And there are some virtual glasses and things that you can do, and taking tours of basilicas and things like that. And how do we enter in those sacred spaces digitally? But it's just another interesting tidbit if you're looking to explore more about digital theology. And I didn't use an example. And also AI. So my final question to you, and I'll wrap this up with the thinking of sort of the metaphorical route that I use, is where will you go from here? In our last few minutes, I'll open up to Q&A. I like this image of Christ on the computer. So when I began to put this together, and I began to think about the Gospel of Matthew came to mind, specifically this verse is, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there among them. And I really think of that in digital spaces, and building those communion in digital spaces and be intentional about it, even if we can't physically hear each other or see each other, but to approach it in that sense of almost, being present to one another, and using that really deep Eucharistic theology to understand ourselves as body of Christ, and how we're not ever separated, even if we can't physically be together. There's digital spaces we can really unify ourselves and continue to do so. And Christ, as the image shows, is there with us. He's there always with us. And I mentioned earlier that digital discipleship, the question is how to be Christ for others on the internet. And I think and I can speak to my face turns blue about youth ministry, but I think that's a really important part too, is how do we teach each other, not just only how to engage there in communion of persons, but how do we support each other to be a reflection of Christ when we are in those digital spaces? So even if we're not really doing Catholic things on the internet, we're still a presence of Christ to others. I think it's a very important point, especially to share with our young people, whether it's your own children or people that you teach in your schools and parishes. And so finally, and I'll open up to any last thoughts or questions or comments that you have, as I created a Google site. If you go into the chat box, the link is there for you. It has, it's just very easy. It has the presentation from tonight, the slides. So if you want to go back over it or take it back to your home place, parish or catechetical setting or wherever, or if you just want to kind of digest it a little bit, you're welcome to it and use it any way you like to. Also have some links there to some helpful resources. And I also included a bibliography of some of the theologians I talked about tonight, so where you can actually get on and look for their books and get a sense of some other ideas that I used in order to frame my thinking for this evening's work. This is completely free for you to use and use it however you like, to revisit and share with others that you like to share about this presentation. But with that, I tell you tremendous thank you. And I will say I'm happy to stay on as long as it takes to answer any questions or to do a Q&A with you guys if you like to go over anything.